Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CAFNA Research Council webinar series. This is our third seminar in the series. Um, Today, Dr. Tony Lupo will be introducing our speaker. I introduced Tony last week. Dr. Lupo is the chair of the CAFNA Research Council. Before I turn it over to Tony, I want to congratulate Tony. Some of you may have seen the announcement that came out just
Thank you.
yesterday that Dr. Lupo won the SEC Faculty Achievement Award. So congratulations, Tony. That's a highly prestigious recognition. So congratulations. I want to remind all of you that you can post your questions using the Q&A box. Please don't use the chat function for that. Please post your questions using the Q&A box. And you can do it, do it at any time. You don't need to wait until the very end to do so. And Tony will facilitate the Q&A session in the end. Well, so without further ado, Tony.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be with you here today. And we are lucky to have with us today Dr. Sarah Lovell, who is the H.E. Garrett Endowed Chair and Professor and Director of the Center for Agroforestry. And the Center for Agroforestry is housed within the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. And Sarah came to us from Illinois after she had spent 10 years as a faculty member there, and 3 before that at the University of Vermont. And she, I won't mention the years, but she's a little bit younger than I am, so we'll just leave it at that. She's, her research interests are landscape agroecology and agroforestry, urban agriculture, and multifunctional landscapes. And she's got a lot of peer-reviewed publications under those topics. So without further ado, Sarah, you've got the floor.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk more about agroforestry and really think about how we connect it to our current situation. It's neat to be able to do that. I also wanted to thank those who are participating with us today. I know we're all kind of inundated with webinars and Zoom meetings and everything else. So I appreciate you taking your time to spend a little bit of that with me today. So first I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about agroforestry and what it is. And then as we start to think about its applications for a health crisis like we're in, we'll talk about the relationship with human health and aspects of agroforestry that connect directly to that. And then also talking about regional food security, which is also coming up as an important topic during this pandemic crisis that we're in. So first, talking about agroforestry and what it is. You may or may not have heard the term, and even if you've heard it, you might not know exactly what it means. So if you look at that word, agroforestry, it's basically 2 topic areas. It's the agro stands for agriculture, and then forestry is obviously the tree aspect. So we're basically taking trees and shrubs and we're integrating those with crops or livestock. So that's the agricultural aspect of it. And from this image, you can see that there are many different applications of how this occurs in the landscape, from things like windbreaks to alley cropping. And so there are a number of different pieces of agroforestry. So in reality, agroforestry has been around for thousands of years, literally. And in the tropics, we've seen it in home gardens. These would be multi-layered gardens that people would have connected to their residence, that would have fruit trees and berry shrubs and other types of perennial crops or edible species growing in the understory underneath the trees and shrubs. We're also familiar with it if we're connected to it. If you're a coffee drinker, coffee, if it's called shade-grown coffee, that means that the coffee is grown in the understory of other trees. So that's also a form of agroforestry. Sometimes those trees that are growing above the coffee are fruit-producing trees, like mangoes can be used in that application. And the coffee is growing on something that's more like a shrub. So, but if we move to thinking about what happens in temperate zones, we've really focused on agroforestry through these 5 different key practices that we'll talk about. So the first one is alley cropping. And this is basically taking just rows of trees. They could be trees that are grown for timber, or they could be trees that are grown in an orchard type of setting. And then putting a companion crop into the alleyway of those systems. So in the timber scenario, where you can imagine growing rows of trees for a timber product, imagine that when you first plant those trees, they're quite small and they're pretty far apart. The rows of trees have a good distance between them. So there's even a long period of time before there's much shade at all in that system. And so you could certainly grow vegetables or grain crops or a lot of different options that can be grown in between those tree rows. It can also be applied in an orchard type of setting. So maybe nut trees are the application, but instead of just having a grass alleyway, you're actually putting a crop in between those tree rows. Another type is forest farming. And in this scenario, we're talking about an existing forest system and looking at opportunities to grow high value crops that are already well adapted to shade and actually prefer shade environments. So these would be things like mushrooms and ginseng that grow really well in that forest habitat. They would grow naturally in that area. Another application or practice is a riparian buffer. These are designed specifically for protecting water quality. So trees and shrubs are planted along the edges of streams and lakes, and they help to capture some of the nutrients and sediments that are coming from the fields nearby. Another application that actually brings in animals is called silvopasture. So in this practice, we're intentionally combining trees, forage, and livestock. There are a couple different ways this is usually done. One option is to have a pasture area that already has livestock in it and add trees into that pasture area. They, of course, have to be protected when they're younger so that the livestock don't damage them. But over time, the trees become large enough that they provide a really great benefit for the livestock in shading the animals. And studies have shown that the animals perform better in terms of milk production or weight gain and things like that if they're in a comfortable environment like that. The other application is looking at forested areas, managed forests, and opportunities to integrate livestock into those areas, as long as the density of trees is correct so that you can get a forage crop growing underneath. And then finally, we have the application of a windbreak. These, as the name suggests, are designed to protect from wind. They can protect soil, so to keep soil from eroding, from wind erosion. They can protect crops. So certain crops can be very sensitive to even heat damage or desiccation from wind. And livestock. Livestock can also benefit from that protection. Another application for windbreaks is that they can help with odor reduction, particularly in a situation where there's a livestock confinement facility. And so we've done some research in our group actually looking at the mitigation of that odor that helps improve the air quality and therefore the quality of life for the rural residents. Because if you think about some of those larger confinement facilities, it's the nearby residents who have the biggest issues with those. So those are some of the applications. Here are some pictures. Several of these are from Missouri. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see in the upper corner a situation with cattle that are grazing under pecan trees. In the lower portion, this one is at Wardak, one of our research facilities, and having cattle under managed oak. In the upper middle, we have an example from Suffolk in the UK, looking at coppice hazelnut. and they're growing vegetables in between. In the lower portion, cattle under southern pine. In the upper right, that's an application you can see that's the riparian buffer zone. And that Bear Creek area in Iowa, that particular buffer application has been very, very highly studied over the years to just really show the benefits of riparian buffer zones for water quality. And then in the bottom right is another one from WARDAC. Okay, so in addition to those 5 practices, we've actually added a 6th practice. And this is really in response to the vast number of people living in urban areas and the need to think about what we can do in urban areas that connects with trees and with agroforestry. So we've added the 6th option that we'll call urban food forests. And here we're intentionally integrating food producing trees and shrubs and other perennial vegetation. And the overall goal is to really focus on the sustainability and the resilience of urban communities. So this can mean bringing healthy, fresh food into communities, but also like adding an educational component. This is really a great opportunity to integrate people, connect people with their food systems and remind people that where their food comes from, that we actually have trees and shrubs that grow these edible items. And if you look along the bottom there, these are all items that can easily be grown in an urban food forest. So there are just a wide range of persimmons and pawpaws, a lot of different berries can be grown. Really any orchard tree can also be grown if it's suited to the environment. And the structure of these can vary a lot, but the diagram that you see kind of in the middle there shows that you can have this multi-layered structure where you could have some tall trees that might be a nut producing tree, then lower trees, and then more of the ground vegetation. On the right of that is where you see this, what it actually looks like in an urban environment. That one's in Kansas City, and it's an urban food forest that has a really wide range of edible species in there. But if you look at it, you can't even hardly tell that it's any different than any other sort of garden setting. So it's really about selecting those species that are edible. So kind of pushing this to the next level is looking at agroforestry and really pushing that productive component of it. So in this case, we're talking about specifically emphasizing specialty crops, woody specialty crops. So specialty crops, also called like horticultural crops, are typically fruits and nuts when we're talking about edible woody species. So it can be tree nuts, it can be trees that produce fruit, and then there are a lot of berry shrubs as well. And this diagram shows how these can be grown sort of in this layered system as well, but in an organized manner where they could be harvested still in a commercial way. So an example might be having that canopy tree being pecan, which is the image that you see in the upper right. Then an understory tree could be a pawpaw tree, and then you have shrubs that are grown in between. So you can see that a lot of products can be produced in these, all of these growing within a row, but then between those rows, you can have a whole nother set of crops that could be a grain crop, or it could be vegetable crops growing in between those rows. So some examples here too, on the left-hand side, these are from Napton, Missouri, a system where they have chestnuts growing, but instead of just a conventional orchard, they're producing winter wheat in between the rows of trees. In the middle, you can see an example of black walnut with spring oats on the top. On the bottom is pecan with bluegrass hay. And then on the right-hand side, you see an example from Southeast Kansas with pecan growing along with spring oats. So again, you're just adding another layer of productivity. So let's connect this in with our current situation. So in a global pandemic, one thing that we're realizing and hearing a lot about is that the human health aspect is really important. And we've heard a lot about this idea of the underlying health conditions. So people are having worse outcomes for sure if they have these underlying health conditions. A lot of these conditions are related to the human diet. And if you look at the item on the right, which is part of the messaging along with COVID-19, it talks about these underlying conditions and some are related to things like heart disease, diabetes, other things like severe obesity, and all of the related illnesses connected with that. And we know that our human diet is very much tied into this. And so agroforestry provides a lot of the healthy items that can help improve the human diet. So there's that aspect. There's a more direct aspect in that certain foods can actually provide specific immunities towards certain diseases. And then we're also finding that some foods can help with our response actually in terms of coping with things like the disease and the isolation. So they're helping with the stress response. So that's kind of another unique way to think about it. And we know that Missouri has great potential to grow some of these fruits and nuts that are very specifically helpful in this situation and offer these nutrient-dense options. So if we're thinking about our diet again, we know there are recommendations in terms of what we want for different aspects of the diet for vegetables versus fruit or grains. If you're going on the right-hand side here, they talk about this healthy eating index score. And in America, our healthy eating index score averages around 59 out of 100, which is not good. So there's a lot of room for improvement in our healthy eating. And there's a very much an economic aspect to this as well. So the spending on medical related costs related to these diseases is huge, up to $316 billion for heart disease. So the idea that we focus more on fruits and vegetables and nuts as a source of protein can really help, again, with a lot of these aspects. And we want this to be very data driven. Like our dietary guidelines need to be driven by data, by research. And so by funding and actually putting activity and our resources toward the research, we're going to have a good return on investment. Now, more specifically talking about COVID-19, as you know, because it's a brand new strain, we don't have studies that have tested specific fruits and vegetables with this specific strain of the disease. So all we can really do at this point is really draw on research that's been done on similar viruses, and that would give us some indication of what we might benefit from in terms of reducing the risk of getting the disease. So we know that flavonoids in fruits and vegetables can serve many anti-inflammatory benefits. So in agroforestry, we have this option to produce a lot of fruits, and in particular berries can be very useful for this, and they're an important component of the agroforestry system. Vitamin C specifically serves as an anti-inflammatory, and it can reduce the incidence of pneumonia. Now, if you look at the image on the right-hand, kind of the upper right-hand side, that's an image of black currant. And black currant, even though it's not something that we are super familiar with and that we consume regularly, it's a fruit that's super high in vitamin C, more than oranges, more than many of the other fruits that we hear of with vitamin C. So black currants are a great option in agroforestry. Another interesting aspect of black currants is that they're shade tolerant. So if we're looking for berry shrubs that can grow underneath nut trees, if we're looking at that mixed system, they're also a really good option with that. Elderberry is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but it specifically is a berry that inhibits replication and viral attachment in, again, we don't know about this particular strain of coronavirus, but it has been tested in a related strain. And then also the idea of foods being able to reduce stress and help people with coping, whether it's coping with other people, their friends getting disease, or if they're coping with the isolation aspect, that's definitely something we want to consider. Okay, so talking about elderberry. Elderberry is an interesting shrub. It's a large shrub that has edible berries, and the flowers themselves are edible as well. The image on the left-hand side, you can see elderberry when it's in flower. It's actually a beautiful shrub. And those flowers, of course, then turn into berries that are very healthy. It's native to Missouri, so it grows very well In fact, you can find it growing in ditches and other areas that are sometimes those marginal areas where other things don't like to grow that much. So elderberry has been shown to actually have this great influence over the cells and the proliferation of disease. So this particular study looks at this coronavirus that's, again, it's not COVID-19 strain specifically, but it looked at a related one. And here on in the A cells, it's showing what happens to the infected cells as the concentration of elderberry extract is increased. And so you see a profound decrease in the infected cells with these higher concentrations. And similarly, when the concentration is increased, a reduction in the virus overall. This image shows really how that happens, how that inhibition of virus works. So you see the virus and then the cells, the blood cells that the virus is trying to attack. In the A portion of that figure, it's showing that what happens if there's nothing there, if none of the bioactive compounds are available, and you get that attachment. In B, where you have those bioactive compounds, it's really inhibiting that replication of the disease. So it's helpful to see how that works. Another specialty crop that I'm going to talk about is black walnut, which also can be a great aspect or a great component of an agroforestry system. It's a very common tree in Missouri, just even growing naturally in forests, and people will actually just gather up black walnuts to be able to use those for production. And these also have specific health benefits that could help in this particular situation. So they help with heart health. They exert this very protective pressure on coronary heart disease, reducing cardiovascular disease, reducing incidence of stroke. And what's interesting is that with black walnuts, it's even more extensive in these health promoting benefits than other nuts. And that appears to be related to these specific levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids, these N6 and N3 components. Another interesting thing is that with the Center for Agroforestry is we have this opportunity to really focus on even further promoting the compounds that are known to be most beneficial. And we can do that through selection and breeding of our species. There has been some data that also show that black walnut can help with improving mood and lowering depression. So that gets back at this coping with isolation or tragedy that we would see in our current situation. So there are a lot of articles on black walnut and more coming out all the time. There's a lot of interest in this nut, even very specifically. If you look at the figure on the right-hand side, it shows black walnuts compared to other nuts. And here you can see that the components, the composition of these different fatty acids are really different here. And it shows that N6 and the N3 components, very different. Okay, so even thinking beyond the human health aspect, another thing that we're seeing that maybe we wouldn't have predicted to the extent that we're now actually able to witness is the disruptions in the food chain that can occur during a pandemic. And these can occur throughout the entire chain. So on the right-hand side, I've included a food system chain showing all of the different aspects of a food system. So some of the things that we're seeing are that certain foods are limited because of either transportation or just overuse, people trying to hoard or collect a lot of these foods. Also, for some people who have lost jobs, their money to purchase food has been reduced. We're seeing situations where there are processing facilities that have temporary closures. So that's like one piece of the puzzle, and that one falls out, it impacts the whole food system. We also have an aging farmer population. So if you think about those who could be most impacted by the disease, it is people who are older, and so many of our farmers in the United States, and particularly in the Midwest, are in that age group. also related to the production and is farm laborers who also have less access to health resources. So that could be impacted. And then we also see things related to the inputs that might be reduced. I've heard of situations where, you know, a company that provides seed has had several people test positive for COVID-19, and so they've had to shut that facility down. We're seeing different things related to trade and import restrictions with different countries, so it's very much this global piece. Just this week, we heard about this meat supply company, Smithfield, having to shut down their entire facility because of just a huge outbreak of COVID-19 in that one facility. And it's in South Dakota, so it's in a place that wasn't hit much to a great extent otherwise, but they had so much spread in this one facility. And actually, as I heard last night, they were up to like 545, I think, individuals just from this one plant impacted. So that plant had to shut down, and they don't know when it will reopen. And it supplies, I think, 4 to 5% of the pork for the US. So all of those pieces fit into that. And you can just see how that disruption in the food system and any one piece of those could have impacts downstream in people's ability to actually obtain foods that they're desiring. So one way agroforestry can contribute to this is by offering these items that are very healthy, they're nutrient rich, and they can also be put into shelf stable forms. So they can be stored for long periods and may be used as sustenance during a disruption like what we might experience related to the situation. So we see that processing can be an important aspect. We can do different things to process items. In particular, for something like elderberry, the potential to do freeze drying of fruit, berries, and other items can be helpful. These become very stable. They can last for years, 2 to 5 for sure, and in many cases probably more. The other benefit from freeze-dried foods is that because it removes all the moisture, the materials are super lightweight, and they can be condensed as well. So they can be almost powdered into a very condensed, lightweight form that makes it really easy to transport them and very inexpensive to transport them. Walnuts, if we're thinking that direction, they also store extremely well. They store in airtight containers and can be chilled and stay fresh tasting for a good year anyway. And then we can also do other types of processing, like extracting the oils from walnut or extracting juices from the berries. So a lot of good options here to have nutrient-dense foods available all the time. And again, it's so neat to think that these 2 crops, and they're just 2 among many, that could be grown locally here in Missouri and really contribute to our own food security and help farmers to diversify their operations. So we see opportunities for the farmers themselves to integrate specialty crops on their farms. They might devote a field or 2 to these crops, or they could even integrate some of these into the riparian buffer zones or windbreak areas that might be treed anyway. Residents, so just any of us really, could plant edible species in our home gardens if we have space for that. And thinking at larger scales, like the scale of a city, city planners could even include edible plantings in parks, along the railway preserves, campuses, et cetera, greenways. On the map on the right shows, just for elderberry, a map that was done by Missouri Ag Intel and the CARES group to map out suitability of where a crop like elderberry would work well in Missouri. And again, it's native to this area, so there's a very wide range of where it would be appropriate to grow. These ideas are also very compatible with some of our initiatives that we have in Kafner and in the state overall. So if you think about this, the Show Me State Food, Beverage, and Forest Products Manufacturing Initiative that we've heard a lot about lately, it basically has three main themes in there, and 2 of them are extremely tightly connected with agroforestry and with the items I'm talking about here. So the regional food systems is one. So thinking about how we enhance the food value chains at regional levels and even down to the scale of local, very local communities. And then there's thinking about the foods for health. So focusing specifically on food items that provide healthy items and outputs for rural communities and urban communities in Missouri. So thinking about how do we improve the health status of our own communities. And one of the items, if you look below that on the lower right, shows kind of the assessment of what our current status is, where we produce a lot of agricultural and forest commodities, but maybe we're sending a lot of that value, and we are sending a lot of that value out of the state. We're not capturing some of the value that we could. So thinking about the things we're talking about with processing into forms that are more useful, more valuable, more transportable, like the idea of freeze drying and making that a lightweight material, that is value that Missouri can keep in state, and it benefits the local stakeholders here. So it shows we have so much room to expand in that area, and even really expand our research and development in general related to those items. So that's really what I have for the presentation. I wanted to leave some references for anybody who's interested in further reading. This is just a short list of many, many different articles that have come out related to elderberry and black walnut. And I focused on those basically because, they're just two examples of two very nutrient dense options that fit well into the human diet, are easy to process into shelf stable forms, and they're super well adapted to Missouri. So many growers, many farmers, many landowners in Missouri could actually benefit from these. So that's all I have, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thanks to our speaker for a very interesting talk. I didn't know that those bushes I cut down in my yard are elderberry. So I learned something today myself.
Yeah, well, actually with elderberry, you could actually cut elderberry back every year and still let it grow back. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. The first question was, what is the status of high oleic soybean? High oleic soybean from MU Technology, or through MU Technology.
I'm probably not the best to answer that question, because that doesn't really fit into the agroforestry realm, so I'm just not super familiar with the latest going on in that area.
All right, and someone asks, can elderberries grow under black walnuts?
So elderberries are somewhat shade tolerant, but that there's a caveat there in that many species that are able to grow under some shade are less productive, especially in terms of fruit production. So if you're really trying to optimize the fruit production, then it would be better to have those in more of a sunny setting, but they probably would grow okay.
And is there a program, are there programs to introduce berry bushes or trees into community gardens? Mm. And I'm guessing they're wanting to know about this more locally.
Yeah, so it varies from place to place. There are definitely programs, even federally funded programs that bring resources to a local community that are connected at least with urban agriculture. And so there's no reason you couldn't try to access those same funds for urban agroforestry as a form of urban agriculture. I also see a lot of potential for urban areas to try to link this food production piece with some of the other initiatives for tree planting. I don't know if some of you may have heard of some of the canopy, like million tree projects, and like attempts for cities to develop more of a tree canopy across the entire city, because there have been many different environmental benefits, including reducing the urban heat island effect. So there's no reason we couldn't suggest that many of those trees could be nut producing or fruit producing trees. Good question. Yeah.
And has Missouri wine industry embraced elderberries for commercial production?
I think some probably have. You know, every winery is a little bit different, so I wouldn't try to speak on behalf of the whole industry by any means, but I think elderberry is definitely a great option just to diversify the wine offerings, and just have, you know, if they are doing any sort of fruit wines, this would be one of the better ones to do, because it has, you know, the profile is somewhat similar in terms of, you know, the color and a little bit of a dryness or something to it is what you might have with a grape.
Okay. Are there any other questions? And one more has popped up. Have you heard anything about in Missouri?
Oh,
and that's spelled G-O-J-I, goji berry. I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah. Yeah, those can grow. They're, you know, maybe probably not as productive as some of the other species that we've talked about here, but they are an option. And there's people are interested, like when we talk about the urban food forest, that's where there's a lot of interest in really having this super wide variety of different species, because it gives people a really unique opportunity to taste, you know, the very different complexities of different berries, and also see like the shrub structure and how these plants grow in that type of environment. A lot of the plants that we're talking about can actually be used as even as ornamental landscape plants, because they have good characteristics just for being in an urban setting. So I think it's neat to kind of diversify and have a lot of those different options available.
Okay. It looks like there's quite a few questions now about what kind of things grow in Missouri. So if folks want to address that to our speaker,
yeah,
maybe, and if others would like to move on, I'll turn it back over to Shabu, and we'll close it up.
Yeah, and let me just say that the Center for Agroforestry has on our website, we have a lot of resources, and so there are a lot of like
Shabu?
and looking at all of the different options. That's a good place to find a lot of that material.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Tony. I know there are a few more questions that showed up, and I promised everybody we will try to keep it for 30 minutes, but it's almost 40 minutes. But that's good. That shows that, you know, there's a lot of interest in the topic, and so thank you for sticking with us for an extra 10 minutes. I will try to wrap up, but again, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. I want to draw your attention to the next two seminars. So we have another one next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Dr. Carolyn Orban from Department of Health Sciences, School of Health Professions will be talking to us, and her talk will be on patterns of pandemics in rural Missouri from 1918 flu to COVID-19. So Dr. Orban will be with us next week. Well, on April 29th, week after next, again on Wednesday at 2 p.m., we will have Dr. Sam Halsey from the School of Natural Resources, and she will talk to us about using models as a tool to predict and prevent the spread of disease epidemics. So I hope you will be able to join us again for next week and the week after. I continue to explore topics. So please, if you have ideas for the webinar series, topics that you would like to hear, please send me an email. And also, if you have suggestions for speakers, I welcome those as well. So thank you all again, and thank you, Sarah, very much. You all have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. That was very good.
Thank you for hosting. I appreciate it. No, it was fun to put that together, actually. I really enjoyed pulling some of this together. So.
Well, I also would like to mention one more thing. There are two people behind the scene helping us with the logistics, James Hundle and Michelle Enger. So I want to make sure that I mention those names, and thank you, James and Michelle, for all the help. See you all next week. Bye now.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.